Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh to everyone, and Jazakumullah khairan wa ahsan al-jazaa for joining us for this kind of short webinar. And I know that the weather here in the UK is absolutely amazing. So, inshallah ta'ala, we don't want to take too much of your time as well. And we just want to kind of have a brief discussion about half an hour, inshallah ta'ala. We are going to spend speaking a little bit about Dr. Yaqub's book, which is Why History Matters. And the second half an hour, essentially, we'll also spend speaking about the new course that Dr. Yaqub, inshallah ta'ala, will be teaching. I know Dr. Yaqub's waiting for me to kind of hand it over to him, and I'm going to let him unmute, etc. as well. I'm going to just make him co-host, so he should, inshallah ta'ala, be able to do all of that. And inshallah ta'ala, Dr. Saab, whenever you're ready, alhamdulillah, he's with us. Dr. Yaqub, I hope you're having a lovely Saturday here. I don't know if you're in the UK or if you're abroad. The weather here is lovely, mashallah.
That's it's not often like it is actually quite surprisingly good weather
Alhamdulillah.
today. Yeah, I'm in London at the moment.
Alhamdulillah,
It's nice.
Alhamdulillah.
Yeah.
So, Sheikh, I
Mm.
thought we'd spend the first half an hour just
Yeah,
speaking a little bit about this new book that you've just written, mashallah. Absolutely
sure.
amazing, amazing kitab, amazing book. Why History Matters, Reviving Faith Through the Lens of History. And from my understanding, Sheikh, I'm going to let you just speak all about this book, inshallah, kind of introduce it. And my understanding of this book is essentially that it's encouraging us to look at history through a different way completely. And it's coming from a very traditional perspective as well. And the
Yeah,
idea is that we learn to take lessons from history through an Islamic lens. And this is quite unique, to be honest with you. And I've been speaking with Dr. Saab privately as well, inshallah ta'ala, just to explain a few things. That one of the things I noticed as well, coming from a traditional circle and coming from a traditional background, whenever I read academic works, even from Muslims, I don't feel I'm reading an Islamic. I wouldn't be able to tell this is a Muslim writing, to be honest. And I think, if I'm not mistaken, Dr. Yaqub, I think you are trying to say in this book that we do need to let, I think in one place you quite clearly say we need to say Allah on the page of the actual book as well. And we need to
yeah.
see the seerah, we need to see the lessons from the Quran actually being found as you're studying history. And Dr. Sam, I'm just going to leave it over to you, and I'm going to let you also present if you need to, whatever. I'll leave it up to you, inshallah ta'ala.
Okay, assalamu alaikum everyone. So you can just jump in whenever you feel necessary if you have any questions or points or so forth. So the book was a bit of a journey. I mean, I started teaching this way when I was in Turkey. So for those of you who don't know, I lived in Turkey for from about 2013 to 16 on and off, and then from about 2016 until 2024 I was permanently living in Turkey, where I was working in they call it the Ilahiyat department, which is like the theology department. Now the reason why they have the term Ilahiyat is because when the Turkish Republic was formed, the Turkish reforms were based on some sort of model that was similar to what we saw in the West. And Ilahiyat was like similar to the sort of like divinity schools that existed in the West. So that's why they call it that. But most Turks would be more confident in saying that the Ilahiyat departments, however, are far more than just Islamic studies. And I think what I saw in the Muslim world, at least, and this is the argument I've made for a while, is that Islamic studies and Ottoman studies in particular, two disciplines, they're not a Muslim enterprise, they're a Western enterprise. Um, so the field of Islamic studies doesn't emerge from the Muslim world. We have ulum ad-din. We had no need for engaging or thinking up or conjuring up something called Islamic studies. And that happens in the West initially as a way of understanding Islam academically or intellectually or politically in the way that they saw fit. Now, since then, Muslims have entered the field of Islamic studies and have engaged with the discipline in various ways and have more recently been a lot more influential in getting their voices heard. But the engagement is still one that happens in a space which is supposed to be objectively secular. Um, Ottoman studies now, for me, is I would argue is also a Western enterprise in the sense that the fall of the Ottoman Empire, um, the British in particular were primarily interested in during their colonial period on the Ottoman Empire and on the Asian subcontinent. Those were their two main areas of real interest regarding Islam. That's not to say that was their only interest. I mean, they colonized, Malaysia and parts of uh, large parts of Africa and so forth. But the main idea for them, the two main jewels, was the Ottoman world because they were engaging with an Islamic entity, which was a power at the time, and India because it was seen as the United Kingdom's backyard. And so, as a consequence of that, we start to see another development regarding the field of Islamic studies and in particular Ottoman history, right? And once again, when I was doing my master's and then when I did my PhD, the engagement with the field of Ottoman studies was quite strange because it felt like I wasn't studying anything that was Islamic. It was so the early Ottomans are presented as, pagans or come into to Islam via a form of they were initially pagans who came into Islam, but the Islam was a bit of a hodgepodge, and so it wasn't very clear or clarified or crystallized in any shape or form. And then you get the sort of like argumentation of the conquest of Constantinople is something where the the Ottomans now are integrated within a sort of world of Christendom, and so there is an amalgamation between Islamic and sort of like Christian civilizational thought. And then you have the Ottomans becoming a Khilafah, but they're not really interested in being a Khilafah. This is, they're not a real proper Khilafah in some degree. And then there is the long period of sort of like decadent and decline. And so once again, the reason being is because the Ottoman Islam wasn't sufficient for them. And then you got the long 19th century stretch, which is a period of secularization, and then the creation of the Turkish Republic. And so where is Islam? It's primarily not there. So my lived experience as a Muslim academic who was teaching history, engaging with it, and then Turkey gave me this sort of like halfway space where the Ilahiyat was a space where it was important to be academically vigorous, but to some degree they still had a program of ensuring that the students were Islamically capable. So that gave me a little bit of freedom to sort of like push the boundaries a little bit regarding how we could do history or write history f from an Islamic framework, and what would that look like? And I think I faced a lot of challenges with that initially, which is when I made the proposal, it was presented by many, not just the academics, but even people in the field of ilm, that this was not necessary. I mean, what is it that I'm trying to engage with, or what is the exercise? What is the objective? Because even now, I'm thinking long and hard about the possibility of writing something where do we need an Islamic methodology of writing history or an Islamic school of writing history? Now, the reason why I say that is because from the 19th century onwards, history as a discipline becomes very heavily entrenched in the Western camp. Most people who are going to do history these days are going to go to the universities to do that. And they've got a host of schools, the Arnold Schools of Writing History, the Frankfurt School of Writing History, the Cambridge School of Writing History. These various movements emerged in the West in particular about from what lens history ought to be written from. And then there's a host of methodologies of writing histories as well, in which you've got, there is some space in the academic world to engage with and tolerate sort of like Marxist thought of writing history. And we had this huge movement of Marxist thinkers who started to influence the way we looked at history writing from the perspective of society and economics and materialism and capital. We have possibilities of writing history from a feminist discourse to a liberal discourse to even an environmentalist disposition. You could write history from all these various fields. An Islamic endeavor is somehow critiqued because fundamentally, to do it from an Islamic perspective, I guess the argument is that one ought to be Muslim, right? And that sort of argumentation is then suggested as there is some sort of like exceptionalism here. And so I've been accused in this endeavor, and the term is quite commonly used, is this idea called devotional bias, that because you are um, of a particular faith group, that when you write from that perspective, that you inherently will have a devotional bias, and as a consequence of that, your work can't be objective. Um, Now, I make the case in the book quite frankly. There's no such thing as objectivity in this vocation. It's an interpretive vocation, and it's designed fundamentally. So the way that this kind of weird engagement began was when I got into a conversation or stroke confrontation with an academic. And I haven't said this story to anyone actually. It's the first time I'm saying it where I said to the academic, describe how you see me. And so he described me. He goes, you're wearing these clothes, you look like this, and this. And I said, that's not how I would describe myself. And there was a silence in the room because I said, well, the things that you noticed about me are not the things that I hold as important or value about how I would like to talk about myself. Um, and the point I was making to him is that your perspective is tainted in the way that you see me. There are some inherent biases that you also have and you subscribe to in the way you describe me. Now, the argument that many would put forward is this old adage of everyone's holding a part of an elephant, right? There's three blind men, the famous story goes, and one blind man is holding the trunk, one blind man holding the leg, and one is holding the ear, and they describe the elephant. And as a result, they're describing different parts of the elephant, but this is their truth, and each person has their own truth, and there are multiple truths out there. So in actuality, it's all valid. And once again, I said, look, that's not the point I'm making here. I mean, I'm trying to understand the elephant as a whole. So what we're trying to do as Muslims is listen to all of the blind men holding parts of the elephant and put it together and say, okay, this is the complete picture of what's taking place. And I felt then, as a Muslim, that there was a problem because it wasn't that people were just simply describing me eh, from a perspective of a deficiency in terms of they're only seeing one perspective of me. In fact, I started to learn that the way that they were describing me was ideologically driven. It was driven by the sort of like way that they understood the world and the way they understood their place in the world. And that was important for me, which was that the way that there is some sort of you can say sort of like arrogance and sort of like hubris in the Western academic space in assuming that it has the right to speak of everyone else in the way it sees fit, and then that is the valid perspective in which things can be spoken of. Um, it just irked me. I mean, it's like so I live in Turkey. In England, we have this show called Question Time. What's fascinating about Question Time is they talk about every single person that exists in the world. They'll say, what's happening in Iran? Let's talk about it. What's happening in Syria? Well, let's talk about it. What's happening in, Leicester? Let's talk about it. But it's not just let's talk about it for the sake of talking about it. It's like, what can we do? What is our objective? How can we intervene? There was this particular agency they gave themselves in Question Time. Now, you don't get that in the Muslim world. There's no show in Turkey that I've seen saying, okay, let's talk about what's happening in London and how can we intervene? How can we engage in this way? What can we do regarding the United Kingdom? So there was a clear distinction in terms of this particular level of power that was being exercised in the way that the academy itself was speaking about Islam and Muslims. And I just thought this is not right. And I can tell you this. I remember during my master's days, I walked into one classroom, and I won't name the professor. I was auditing, and it was a history class. And we walked in, and he said, um, "Just for the Muslims out there, we're going to leave Allah outside of the classroom. Okay, we're going to talk about history, but Allah has to be outside of the classroom." And I remember the Muslims, we just looked at each other like a little bit bemused um, thinking, what's going on here? Like, why is he assumed that we're not going to have anything intelligible to say, and that he's already created this caveat that yes, we're going to talk about Islam, but we're not going to talk about Allah here, or Islamic history and so forth. And I remember we became conditioned into keeping our mouths shut. And I've said this before that you can write about Ibn Khaldun, you can't be Ibn Khaldun. You can write about Al-Ghazali, you just can't be him in the academy. The academy doesn't offer that space. So then I started saying, okay, wait, look, what's going on here? And then I think the one issue that really irked me the most was when I was writing my thesis and my PhD thesis, and one academic said to me, because I'd written in the footnote that Allah says in the Quran. Now, this was an instinctive reaction by me as a Muslim, and I was told that that needs to be omitted. I can't say that. So I was a bit confused at the time because I didn't realize where the mistake was. And I said, well, what do you mean by that? And then the academic intervened by saying, you have to say the Quran says. I said, oh, okay, that's interesting. So wait a minute. Um, who wrote the book? And it was like, well, look, I'm not getting into this debate. That's not the point. I said, okay, fine. Look, when we do footnotes, we write the name of the author. So here, who's the author of the Quran? And in the end, I was forced to concede where I had to write TQM, translated meaning of the Quran, and just leave it as that. I mean, it's weird where I can write TQM, translated meaning of the Quran, and then put, someone like Yusuf Ali's name down, but I can't write Allah Ta'ala's name down, right? So, and people don't appreciate this perhaps, but that was very aggressive because what it did is it took my engagement, my interaction with the Quran away from me. I had to condition myself that I have to, engage. There will be times in my life and in my career where I'd have to engage with people in which the Quran would have to be presented in a manner in which the author of the Quran more was kept outside of the conversation debate because it was perceived that in by doing so that there is a particular form of bias or an attempt to behave in what they would call a sort of like Muslim missionary manner and I then went to the drawing board and I said okay this we have a situation here because what I find egregious firstly I find it exceptionally egregious that insan, as a Muslim, I'll say this openly, as an insan has the audacity to behave and say, you know what, I'm going to remove Allah Ta'ala's existence from the pages of the works that I'm producing, in which he's inherently a part of. I just find that absolutely diabolical. So that was one thing. But okay, fine, people say, well, that's not the objective of the academy. And whatnot. But what I also realize is, as a Muslim writer, the more I engage with texts about Islam, but having to continuously hide Allah Ta'ala's existence or to redact the Islamic experience or the Islamic vocabulary or the Islamic grammar, meant that without me knowing, it was shaping my own heart in the way I ought to be Muslim. That was, and I think that's very dangerous. It's far more dangerous in some ways than somebody walking out and not dressing appropriately in accordance to the Islamic, manner in which one ought to dress. It's actually, it gets right into your heart and into your mind. You're being conditioned in that context. And so I thought, I need to find a way of responding to this. Now, in the academic world, we have all sorts of movements, the decolonial movement, the post-colonial movement, and so forth, which are trying to counter academic spaces. But I'm not sure if we as Muslims are going to be afforded the space or the opportunity to be able to have an Islamic alternative, and that's fine. Um, and so then I decided, okay, then what's the other space I can operate in? And the other space that is firstly engaging with the sort of like traditional seminaries to make the case that history ought to be a staple. And I make the case in the book that it should be considered as one of the ulum ala. It's seen as something which is maybe additional, but I see it as something that should be supplementary, perhaps, as a way of creating a rounded thinker. Because in the West, at least, historians are seen as intellectuals. That's the tradition of history writing, right? And what's interesting is if I was aware, when I'm interviewed by Western academics, I'm interviewed as a thinker and as an intellectual. They'll interview me and say, tell us what you think is happening in Iran. And does this resonate with anything that you studied in history? And what is your conception about how we look at modernity and time and so forth? Whereas when Muslims were interviewing me, they would say things like, why did the Ottomans ban coffee? It was a very different way of looking at the subject area. I was not seen as a thinker or an intellectual who could help cultivate thought in the community. Instead, I was being seen as a person who's supposed to describe things that happened in the past. And that needed a change. So then the book becomes a culmination of all of these problem areas that I had. And more specifically, then in the Muslim Anglo-speaking space, at least, the emergence of content creation. And content creation was even being done by people who were trained in seminaries, who I felt were producing stories of the historical past, but were not given an account of the discipline of what history is with a capital H. And I just felt that, and this is going to sound harsh, but there is a space for it, no doubt about it. I mean, people are entitled to be informed, perhaps, with this type of information, but are they being well informed or better informed? And what is it adding to them that is giving them something as Muslims to become transformed as being better? Any form of ilm production or knowledge production is designed to improve the disposition of the ummah. So I always say this to my students all the time that as a Muslim, I don't wish for my brother what I wish for myself. I wish better for my brother than what I wish for myself. What I want to see is and excelling in them. And so what I was seeing was, I can't think of another word at this moment in time. It's just slop. And I said, look, this is a problem. And I even engaged with some of these content creators by saying, look, I think you guys you're taking certain liberties with the truth here, and you're taking certain liberties in your historical analysis and your research. And I think that as Muslims, we have to have a better standard than this. This is not okay. Now, I was accused of somebody who's being a bit pretentious because I was an academic, by saying you academic types are such and such. But it wasn't about the academy, actually. It was about a person who was well trained and felt that this discipline, just in the way that Ibn Khaldun was critical of earlier Muslim historians in terms of at times them having a particular level of laxation in their research, that I felt we as a community deserved better. And the question was then, how can we do it better? What do we do? How do we, what is the point of history for us as Muslims? And so then the book came about, and this long story I've gone on about, but these various layers came about because the publisher came to me and says, look, we know you've been teaching in this way in Turkey, and could you write something for us? And initially I was kind of reluctant. I was, I don't think anyone will read it. I don't think that there is a room for this. But Omar Farouk, he's a wonderful brother, and he insisted. And then I wrote the book, and the book was a backwards and forwards. And I had an editing team who were very fair and polite with me, because the earlier drafts were a lot more sloppier, and there was a lot more liberties taken on my side, perhaps. But then we got to a point where we crystallized certain conversations, and my earlier chapters are designed to explain to Muslims that in order to be an Iman orientated knowledge producer and historian, you have to have Iman. And so I first tackle the Muslim by making them understand what it means to have Iman. And before they even touch the production of ilm, that there is a particular disposition they ought to have. There's a particular understanding of their place in the cosmos they ought to have. There's a particular understanding of what their ethics are. So I remember teaching this more recently about a central theme, which I don't make clear in the book, but is in the book, which is the idea of haqq and batil. And for me, haqq is something which is true, haqq is the truth, and haqq is the thing that is real. And then batil is not just something which is false and falsehood, but the thing that is not real. And in a world today where there's a lot of information masquerading as truth, but it's false, and with artificial intelligence augmenting reality and so forth, and then the ways that work, images are being curated and so on, that it's when we're reading and using our imaginations, not just about the present period, but about the past. It's not that my concern is simply that we're producing works which are not true, but at times works can be perceived as being true, but the reality of that period has been augmented in strange ways. And that is a concern for me, that this is not okay for us. And so people sometimes misunderstood when I said haqq and batil, as if I want to show a distinction between the contestations between the Umayyads and the Abbasids. That's not what I mean. I mean the writer themselves have to internalize that they have an objective in when they produce their knowledge, that their knowledge has to be true, that you are a truth seeker, and that you are doing the best of your ability to make sure that what you say is as close to reality as possible. And the ultimate reality is the reality of Allah Ta'ala, that Allah Ta'ala is the only reality. In that sense, um, any writing that is trying to present reality in its truest form cannot redact Allah Ta'ala from it, right? As a Muslim, then, you know, if you as a human being redact Allah Ta'ala, you redact the soul, you take away Jannah, you take away Jahannam, you take away the shaitan, you take away ideas like waswasa, you take away, I don't know, so many different things related to the unseen in many ways. Then the only thing left in regards to what it means to be human is a very material understanding of humanity. And we have that in history writing. But I would argue that as a Muslim that maybe we have a responsibility of doing something else. And so that's the case I'm making in the book. Now, some people argued that do you think it's necessary to put a facade of just putting in Islamic words and terms and so forth? I said no. In fact, I make the case that we have a different understanding of reality. We have a different understanding of time. We have a different understanding of purpose. We have a different understanding of hardship. We are inspired, and the Quran is not simply a book of inspiration, but it's an instruction. Rasul Sallam is also not somebody we're just simply inspired by it, but he's the idea of Islam, he's the method of Islam, he's an instruction for us. And how could we use those various tools that we have available to us to try to project perhaps a way of writing that when people start reading, that it does something for their Iman. It makes them feel that, okay, Allah Ta'ala exists. Otherwise, what will happen is we would be reduced in understanding that Allah Ta'ala stopped existing after Rasul Sallam died. That's it. That because we reduce Allah Ta'ala to just somebody that does miracles. That's it. And then after the death of Rasul Sallam, there's no wahi, there's nothing. So Allah doesn't, he's no longer important in the human endeavor. He's, and so then people say, well, how would you show Allah Ta'ala's existence in these narratives and stories? I said, that's what the job of the Muslim historian then ought to be, to find a way of using language and vocabulary to make it relevant. Where, like for example, even now, like when you talk about Gaza and the Gazans tell you that they see angels. Well, angels are part of Iman. I have no doubt in why would I not believe them if they said that that's what they experienced? Now, as a historian, how would I document that? That's different. As a historian, I would document what they said. I would say that the people of Gaza said such and such, and I would write it as such, as a way of making the case that I didn't physically see it. But this is how they say it, and then I leave that open to the reader in how they want to engage with it. But what were people in the West saying? Oh, these people have collective PTSD. That's what they have. Now, that's a different outlook about the world. And I'll give you one last example, and then we can talk about parts of the book if you want and so on, which is I remember teaching in class once, Sira, and I've written this in the book. And we came to the Isra and Miraj. And one student, she was from Poland and she was a great student. And we had some Erasmus students who came from Europe who were taking Islamic studies and they would take my classes because I taught in English. And she said, Dr. Yaqub, can I ask you a question? I said, sure, you can. She said, do you honestly believe your prophet sat on a horse with wings? And I looked at her and I smiled. And then I looked at my students and I said, well, how would you answer that? And they looked down at the table. And I laughed and I smiled at my students and I said, you're no different than the Muslims at the time, actually. This is why this is an Aqidah question. That even at the time when Rasul Sallam said that he went to meet Allah Ta'ala, there were people telling him, don't say that. Just say, tell him to pray. But if you tell him you went to meet Allah, and this is why Sayyidina Abu Bakr radiallahu an gets the name of Siddiq. So then I said to her, I said, look, well, here's the issue. We are looking, even though you believe that you're being rational, our rationalities are determined by the sort of like Aqidah, the creed that we carry. So we're being shaped by this. And she goes, in what way? I said, have you ever seen a horse with wings? And I said, look, even Muslim scholars have a difference of opinion of whether the horse had wings or not. But for the argument, let's just go with this horse has wings, just so that we can have a conversation. She goes, all right. I said, have you ever seen a horse with wings? She goes, no, teacher. I said, have you ever found or anyone found any evidence of a horse with wings? She went, no, teacher. I said, has there been any archaeological discovery of a horse with wings? She went, no, teacher. I said, so it's perfectly acceptable for you to assume that the idea of a horse with wings is a myth because we've only seen it in mythology. She goes, yes. Then I looked at one of my students and I said, can I ask you a question? They went, yes, teacher. I said, can Allah Ta'ala create a horse with wings? And the student went, Allah Ta'ala can create anything, teacher. I said, okay. So I said, the difference here is that your argument is predicated on the redaction of Allah's existence. And so you can only make sense of your lived experience in terms of the reality in front of you, because Allah Ta'ala is removed from your reality. And for us, our question comes from the fact that we determine Allah Ta'ala's existence first. And then everything that comes with it is framed within that framework. And I think for me, that became important then, that this type of writing is needed. Now, don't get me wrong. I mean, if people don't want to write in that style, they don't have to. But I think those types of genres are needed from Muslim scholars. They do need to still write that. So if you want to write about, you know, the emergence of the popularity of cats in the 19th century in Istanbul, okay, fine, whatever makes you happy. I don't want to write about those subjects at this moment in time. I feel like the pressing need of this ummah in regards to their engagement regarding learning from the historical past means that not all forms of knowledge is beneficial. So now I'm trying to think about, well, as a historian, in terms of my vocation, what types of works can I produce that are beneficial for this ummah? Because one of the things that I found frustrating, perhaps, is people keep asking me questions, expecting me like Google to keep answering them. And I keep explaining to them that sometimes there's things you want to know, but I'm the expert. Sometimes I need to educate you on what you ought to know. And that's, you don't always know what's right and wrong in terms of the subject area. And this is what I'm trying to engage with. And so I'm trying to encourage as many Muslims as possible to sort of like engage with this sort of like attempt, perhaps, you
Yeah.
know.
So, Dr. Yaqub, I think one thing I can relate to in, for example, my line of research is more on the formation of the schools of law, and that's where my new book is kind of heading towards, which is called An Introduction to the Hanafi Madhab. So
Mhm.
I think I know exactly where you're coming from. So when I was reading about this and I did some research, and you can correct me if you think this is exactly what you're trying to address. And I felt it as soon as I was reading the book that this is exactly the problem I had. So when I read the formation of the Sunni schools of law, and if you don't mind, I'm just going to take a few names because they're all very respected academics, and we have a lot of respect for them, even though they're non-Muslim. So Melchett, Christopher Melchett, who's a lovely writer, obviously, he attributes the formation of the Sunni schools of law to be just after 300 Hijri, and he attributes this to the formation of the student-teacher relationship and the production of, you could say, an idea of a teacher becoming an authority, so to speak, and he's now passing this on to his teachers, and he creates an isnad and he creates books and he encourages them to. Halak then comes in his book, The Origins and Evolution of Islamic Law. Again, both of these are non-Muslim on the appearance of it, at least. In chapter 7 of his book or something, he critiques Melchett, and he says, "No, I don't think the madahib formed because of this reason." He attributes it to something which he calls authority construction. So they all considered Abu Hanifa to now become an authority. Imam Malik has now become an authority. Now I was reading both of this and I'm just thinking, I'm looking at both and I'm just thinking, gosh, for me, it just seems like Allah Ta'ala had just decided these four madahib to be prominent, and the Ummah would now be following these four sets of laws because Allah
Yeah,
Ta'ala had chosen these four scholars to become the representative for the Muslim community. But I just felt
absolutely.
so much like I felt silly almost, exactly what you've written in the book. You almost feel silly writing that in the book, that am I allowed to write this? Because it's so I kind of at the same time, I think I know what you're coming from, where you're saying, if I only attribute it to Allah Ta'ala and I say that's all that happened, no need to discuss why it happened.
Right.
That would also be wrong. I think what you're trying to say is very interesting because you're saying at the end of the day, there was an element of the ultimate element was the divine element. Then we can still study how did Allah Ta'ala choose these people and what were the causes. And I
Yeah.
thought this might be a good example for you to kind of look at as
Well,
well.
I tell you interesting. So Jevdet Pasha, or Alim Jevdet, but he was an alim in the Ottoman Empire. He was part of the Majelle process and so forth. But before that, he was commissioned to be a historian for the Ottoman state. He was the official state chronicler, and in the 19th century, he started writing history differently. He was just like the thinkers in India at the time, the Nadwi school. They started to realize that history is ideological, and there needs to be some sort of adjustment in the way Muslims are writing history because of the introduction of the print press and new forms of learning and so on. And Jevdet talks about Bayraktar, who was um, he was a magnate in the Bulgarian provinces who becomes Grand Vizier, and then he has a very unfortunate death, which is the story is that he blows himself up and kills like 20,000 Janissaries in his home with gunpowder, right? And Jevdet writes, if only Bayraktar was successful, the Ottoman Empire would have been in a very different place. But only Allah knows why he had to die then. And what was interesting is he did his research. He explained what happened. He provided the evidence of Bayraktar's activities, but he still, made the case that, I don't know what the wisdom of Allah Ta'ala is here, in that sense. I don't know why that happened because the course could have been a little bit different. And okay, Allah Ta'ala is testing us in a particular way, and it is what it is. And it was a very intriguing sort of like intervention by him, which is that many scholars did this when they were writing works of history. And I'll tell you another conversation I had, and I didn't write in a book. Once I was with a Zionist academic who we were in a workshop, and he said at the time, many years ago, that one of the great things about writing history is that we've got a little bit of liberty and freedom because the people we're writing about are dead. And I took real exception to that. And in the room where I was the only Muslim, I said, yeah, we can't do that in our tradition. And one of the person goes, what do you mean? I said, well, the fact that people are dead and we're going to be held accountable on the day of judgment because they cannot defend themselves is for that reason that we have to be as watertight as we can be in our explanation of their lived experience. And then we have to caveat that by saying, and Allah knows best, just to absolve ourselves from that as well, right? And that's important because I was, writing about Mustafa Sabri and Al-Milal Hamdi and Sayyid Nursi and Rashid Ridda and so forth. And imagine on the day of judgment, they said, well, you lied about us. Well, this never happened. Now, what am I going to say to Allah Ta'ala? And I think that, that fear of Allah Ta'ala is important. This is going to sound really crazy for some of the people listening today, but I was listening to Kanye West of all people, right? And Kanye West said one of the interesting things that's happened in the West is once you remove the fear of God, you start fearing other things, right? Once you only fear God, you fear nothing but God. And it's an interesting concept he put forward, which is that as a writer, when I have the fear of Allah Ta'ala, and I write that in the book, that part of Iman is to fear Allah Ta'ala. Because when you fear Allah Ta'ala, your work becomes very careful in the way that you're producing it, because you are attributing your work to not simply the truth, but also the idea that you want to be rewarded by Allah Ta'ala, but at the same time that you fear that you don't want to do anything that 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 upsets Allah Ta'ala in the sense of what you're trying to do. There can be no nefarious activity here or sinister intentions. And that's an important sort of like point here, that when I talk about the Allah Ta'ala's existence, I'm not just simply saying Allah Ta'ala's existence in the book, that the writer has to internalize the idea that Allah Ta'ala is everywhere. And the reason why then I want to find writers trying to at least put in a vocabulary where they keep mentioning Allah Ta'ala's existence is because if you're reading and Allah Ta'ala does not exist in 1400 years of historical works, or Allah Ta'ala doesn't exist in, let's just say, the writing of the Meji dynasty, because apparently Allah is only the God of Muslims, then what happens is it becomes very difficult for the young person who goes out today to 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 internalize the idea that Allah still exists, that Allah engages with them in their day to day, that Allah engages in the war in Gaza, that Allah engages in the politics of everything. So the consistency is needed, I think. And so I'm asking for us to be a little bit creative in our vocabulary and grammar, perhaps.
Yeah, I think Dr. Yaqub, Sabit, to be honest with you, we have the genre of fiqh sirah,
Mm.
And I think what you're calling for in this book, and I think it's something which, to be honest with you, we'd need a whole, you're right, we'd need a whole discipline to start on this, which is fiqh tarikh.
Yep.
And there are very few people who have actually managed to write on the fiqh of tarikh itself and the kind of systems and patterns of Allah Ta'ala.
Yeah.
And it would, let's be honest with ourselves, it would have to be someone who's well versed in both traditions, obviously.
Absolutely.
It would have to be someone who really knows the Islamic tradition very, very well.
Yeah.
And I do have a lot of hope that inshallah ta'ala there will be people who are going to come up and take on this responsibility and try to pull this off.
Well, I'm optimistic because, to be honest with you, I didn't think, and this just shows how much I know, I didn't think anyone was going to read this book. So when I wrote it, I said, look, okay, well, who's going to engage in this type of subject matter, and who would be interested? And in actuality, the book sold out, and it was like, okay, people really do want to engage with this. And I really have the confidence that better thinkers than me will start to take this and say, okay, you know what? Maybe this muse, he has something interesting to say here, and maybe we can run with it. Um, and I'm really hopeful that will happen. I'm starting to see the conversations taking place more and more. And so the book was like basically putting down my sort of like limited understanding. I mean, look, I give an example. The Shahada for me became very important because when we say La ilaha illallah, um, Allah Ta'ala doesn't mention it about atheists. He says there's nobody worthy of worship but Him. That means everybody worships something. You just need to figure out what they're worshiping. And that drove me to understand that everybody's writing from a particular aqidah and worldview. They're worshiping something. And so the idea that they can posit, which is that they are being objective, is not true. And I remember I was sitting with Sheikh Isam Idul because he was reading the book next to me once, and he said, "You said here that about that the intention is there's no such thing as objectivity, but the intention is to strive to learn the truth with your own subjectivity. What do you mean by that?" And I said, objectivity in our perspective is that we are truth seeking. But we recognize that we will never know the sum total of the truth because as insan we are fallible. The subjectivity comes into it because of the fact that you are selective in the manner in which you collect the information, in the manner that you tell the narrative, in the manner in which you put the order down, and so forth. And that requires a sort of like human choice making. And naturally, that is subjective. That you have problem, and that's okay. That's not a problem for me. So I talk about in the book afterwards about the idea of imagination, right? And the reason why I wrote about that is because I felt that Muslims feel that imagination is simply something about storytelling and mythologizing. I said, no. If you want to understand, like when I'm telling Sirah, I tell my students, you have to imagine it. You have to imagine what it was like. Imagine what Rasulullah was feeling when he was in the cave. Imagine Badr. Imagine like angels coming from above. What would that mean like? And not only that, I try to teach my students that Quran is the word of Allah. Understand that. Understand whose words you're reading. You're reading the words of the creator of the cosmos, you know. This is what I wanted to
I
then
think
instill.
I think Dr. Yaqub, the one writing, you can feel free to correct me. And inshallah ta'ala, from here, we can kind of just discuss the Ottoman course. And then we can, if you're okay
Yeah,
with it, we can open up for some questions as well.
yeah, sure.
Inshallah. I think one writer that comes to my mind who you can correct me if you wish, who I think would be somewhere close to, but again, a lot more work is going to be needed to kind of build on a lot of what he did, would be Sheikh Abul Hassan Ali al-Nadwi. And he's
Yes.
someone who I think is kind of he tried to do a little bit of what you're kind of encouraging we need more of basically, which is he would kind of at times learn from empires why certain empires did this. And the only thing we've, like you've said, I think at the start as well, we can't allow sloppy research to come in as well. You
Yeah.
can't fall down that kind of rabbit hole where in this was the only reason why this empire fell. We can also learn things about how to interact with other Muslims, considering how empires would interact with one another and what we can learn about this, and I think, I mean, I don't know if I should probably mention this, but again, this is my opinion, and this is not Dr. Yaqub's opinion, so I'll just clarify that. I think one kind of YouTube video and series that has, I think, done this, and they've tried to learn some lessons and kind of apply it to our times, is the Yaqeen Institute. New again, whether you agree with all the ideas, I don't want to get into all that, but at least they're trying something with the whole Salahuddin generation idea. I think, maybe more research is needed on those types of research and those types of content as well. And maybe more of that might actually be more inspiring for the Muslim Ummah as well. I'm just going to quote one thing from Halak, which I think I shared with you as well, which I really found really quite fascinating. And he's got an article on this. And he says in one of the places in his article, and it's called On Orientalism. He says, these works, all Euro-American, are given monopoly over the whole question of origins, indeed over all of Sharia's history, entirely leaving out the contributions of Muslim scholars writing in the Muslim world. For to grant any legitimacy to these latter works is to risk subverting the paradigm's narrative, which, as we saw, constructs history as a structured narrative of power. And I thought that was such an important comment there. And he
Yeah,
says,
absolutely. And this is why then the point I'm making is that what was the alternative framing of power from our perspective? What can it look like? And what is that endeavor and what can that look like? And so the book then talks about the idea of sort of like having the attempt to try to then what I would call the third space, which is a lot of people use the word third space, which is, but the idea is that there's a glass ceiling in the academy and there's only so far you can go, right? And then there is a need then to probably in the field of history writing, political science, fiction, architecture, art, and so forth. In those areas, they still contribute towards a sort of like civilizational growth of societies and communities. And how can we make those compliant? And we've had movements of the Islamization of knowledge before, but history doesn't fit into that Islamization of knowledge because it's always been part of our tradition. And the scholars of India, as you mentioned, like like Nadawi and so forth, it's very interesting because they saw the threat of how history was being instrumentalized by the British in India. And then they felt a need to try to counter that in some shape or form. And they did write history works regarding India. And they said that each new generation, for example, needs to start writing a seerah for its own communities, making it relevant to the type of questions that are relevant to those societies. They made the argument that you should write about the history of Islam again. And in the past, people used to write these large magnus opuses. And then also write about your history as Muslims in the areas that you're in, so that we can know each other better. And so I'm not seeing many Muslims going into the field. And then where do they go? At the moment, unfortunately, I have to keep telling them you have to go into the academy. So how do you navigate that challenge? And that's something which is, I think, difficult.
Mm. Dr. Akub, Jazakumullah khairan so much for this presentation. And I think a lot of people are going to, and I would please do get a copy of the book. I think it's really, really interesting. Even if you just read the first half of the book, you'll get a good idea of what Dr. Yakub is saying. And I think it's really much needed that we kind of draw lessons from history in a very organized way, but in a very kind of, you could say, factual way as well, not just kind of things that make sense to us and things that we're putting our own narrative, our own biases are coming through. We're actually looking at the history and trying to work out what exactly was the pattern of Allah Ta'ala here. And that would obviously still require, I want to emphasize, a good understanding of the Sharia sciences as well. I'm just going to very briefly, Alhamdulillah, Dr. Yaqub Sahab will be teaching a course with us as well. I just want to kind of draw your attention that he will be teaching Ottoman history. Like I said, this is starting on Tuesday. And so please feel free to join this course. I think it's going to be a fantastic. Dr. Yaqub Sahab did tell me something which really blew my mind. And I'm going to let him expand on this just as soon as I finish, which is that when it comes to Ottoman history, a lot of the writers are actually, or there is a significant portion of, you could say, involvement of, you could say, Israeli historians on this topic, which I had no idea about, to be honest with you, on the Ottoman. And I'm just curious, and I'm sure Dr. Sa will just explain to us just now, why are they so interested in the Ottoman Empire and the history of the Ottomans? And this was obviously the last caliphate, you could say. So we will be looking through this. This is the course outline. It's on the website. I will share this Also, in the description of this video, we will be going through the origins of the Ottoman state, expansion into Europe, conquest of Constantinople, imperial expansion and administration, society, culture and religion, military power and challenges, challenges and transformation, reform and modernization, and then the Tanzimat and Abdul Hamid II revolution, World War One, and collapse. So please do join this course. I think you'll find it tremendously beneficial. And Dr. Sab, if you want to just expand on that Israeli idea, and then we can take some questions after that, inshallah.
I think, as I said, Ottoman studies is a Western enterprise. So you see them in universities like Oxford, Harvard, Princeton, Yale. When I was in Japan, they had 23 Ottoman historians in Japan. I'd be very interested to see how many Ottoman historians we have in Pakistan. It's just not a Muslim endeavor. It's not something that Muslims are interested in. When I was in Malaysia, I didn't find Ottoman historians there. Um, I mean, the Israelis being part of the Western Bloc is one of the reasons, and they engage in knowledge production that the West is producing. But the second thing is, the Israelis don't have a Ottoman past. In many ways, the peoples that live in those areas have an Ottoman past. There are debates regarding the transition from the fall of the Ottoman Empire to the creation of the nation state, whereas the Israelis' history is a sort of like it's an intervention in many ways. And so when they write about Ottoman history, one, they're writing about the Palestinians because you don't only take away lives and property and so forth, but you take away memories, you take away identity, you take away imagination. That's one thing that you're doing. And the second thing you do is that you try to make a claim over Islamic history as a way of sort of making the case that the sort of interpretation that Muslims have of themselves is one of nostalgia. I think this is one of the problems that I face, is that in order to make the argument of doing something alternative, often Muslims will make the case that, okay, you want a nostalgic understanding of the historical past. And that's not the point I'm making. I'm saying that the different genres of writing history should be possible. And so what happens is when Israeli scholars write about Muslims in particular, it's very interesting how they try to humanize us in their image. And I write one section in the book where I say the prophets in the Torah are different than the Anbiya in the Quran. It's how you see yourself from your worldview and how you see others in response to that. And so the writing of Ottoman history within the secular space and tradition is often being driven by various actors and spaces in how they talk about Muslims. Now, Muslims don't talk about or write much about Ottoman studies, independent from what's happening primarily in Turkey. There's a lot of emotion in regards to the Ottoman past and how they talk about Ottoman history. They would rather talk about moments or events rather than what can we learn from the Ottomans, what can we take from these particular, and the other point about Ottoman history, which I find a little bit troubling for Muslims in particular, is I always ask them the information that you have read, how can you verify that it is true? What sort of framework have you gone through in order to do that? And there are some Muslim historians like myself now in the field of Ottoman history, which are challenging the large corpus of Ottoman studies in the way that they speak of us. Because the point that Halak makes and Halak's idea of Orientalism, Halak felt that Edward Said didn't go far enough in his criticism of Orientalism. And to some degree, is because Edward Said was a liberal and he was secular. And Halak's fundamental argument actually is if you speak to him one on one, he'll say that the main issue is Islam, right? How do you speak of Islam in some ways? And Ottoman history is Islamic history. But even that's heavily politicized because of the emergence of the nation states in the region. But the Israelis write heavily on Ottoman studies and Turkey, of course. But you don't see that of the Arab countries in the region. It doesn't happen as much. So that tells you something, that we have a bit of a situation.
100%. Jazakallah, Dr. Yakub, for that. And inshallah ta'ala, with that, we've got about 5-10 minutes. So we'll just open up. If anyone's got any question, if anyone wants to unmute as well, just give me a thumbs up or just raise your hand. Inshallah, I'll allow you to also unmute. There was already a comment, and because this is a recorded session, I'll just read out the comments so that the people who are watching this afterwards can kind of see what was the comment that was made. There's a comment here by one of our, mashallah, regular attendees, Sheikh Sayyid Hussein Qadri. He's written, "Thank you for sharing your personal lived experience here. The story of the blind man and the elephant is particularly instructive. If we were to extend that argument further, how did you reconcile devotional tariq writing critical tariq writing epistemologies, contrasting it to the historical critical methods and Western paradigms of reviewing the historical record. So,
Um, can you break that question down just
yes,
so that I can
yeah,
make sense of it?
it is a bit of an interesting question. It's you have sort of addressed it in the session, so you can feel free to answer however you wish. It's how do you reconcile devotional tariq writing,
Mhm.
critical tariq writing epistemologies, contrasting it to the historical critical methods and Western paradigms of reviewing the historical record.
I
So,
don't think, look, the historical critical method in particular, I think that there is a misconception that Muslims are not capable of being critical of the evidences and the information that they see. And there's a section in the book that I write about this. So, for example, Hazarfen jumps from the Galata Tower. This is a well-known story in Ottoman history that Hazarfen jumped from the Galata Tower and he was using a hand glider mechanism to fly to the other side of Uskudad. Now, this is not scientifically possible, okay? And it's in the works of Evliya Çelebi. Now, how would I, as a Muslim, try to make sense of this? Well, one of the things I could do is what Evliya Çelebi says, that Allah took him to the other side, and I could just go with it. But as a Muslim thinker, you'd have to say, wait, there must be more evidence here on this single narration, right? So, are there any witnesses accounts of Hazarfen jumping from the tower and making it to the other side? No. Are there any witnesses on the other side that saw him do it? No. Is there any medals or accolades given by the Sultan? No. What about Hazarfen himself? Did he write any memoirs or any evidence that he did this? No. So we have this one account of a storyteller who is Evliya Çelebi, who makes the case that Hazarfen jumped. And so you would have to be a little bit skeptical of that. And as a historian, you would take into account that that's possibly not true. Now, I then square that with Fatih's conquest of Constantinople. There are multiple accounts of people suggesting that during the conquest, strange things were happening, things that felt very beyond the norm. And I think as a historian, I would document that. And I would document that and write that this is what they experienced and this is what they felt. Fundamentally, I still wasn't there, right? But the point I'm making is that I think as a historian, including um, this or these sort of like explanations, and then as a historian using the best of your ability to do that is important. Khaldun critiques, for example, scholars when they said things like there were thousands of people that came in this battle, and he said the space wouldn't allow that many people to be there. So in that sense, your sort of like irrational imagination is important in terms of, okay, look, could this be possible and how and whatnot? And human beings and scholars would always be exercising that because we're seekers of the truth. I had one story on Ottoman history recently on YouTube where they said the Ottomans built a golden fountain during the siege of Vienna um, to sort of like display against the people who were being sieged in Vienna. This is just not possible. First, the Sultan wouldn't give you that amount of gold to take from Istanbul all the way to Vienna. And then what sort of mechanisms would you have to smelt down the gold and then to turn it into a fountain? And then what type of fountain so that people from thousands of people, miles away behind walls could see? This is just not, achievable in that sense. And so as historians, we're always being skeptical. The instinct is to initially question the validity of the information you have. And what we try to do as historians is have as much information available to us. The more information you have, the more accurate your assessment can be. Um, and that shouldn't have to contradict the sort of like then narrative writing that you have available to you as a Muslim in terms of writing it from that Islamic perspective. And I think that Halad talks about this in his new book. He calls it epistemological humility, right? And the idea of epistemological humility, and I remember talking to him, and I said, it's just La ilaha illallah, right? It's the recognition that you submit to Allah Ta'ala. That there has to be some level of that. No, I mean, for me, this is the point I keep making, that the assumption that because I'm Muslim, that somehow I'm not going to be vigorous is not true. In fact, I have to be twice as vigorous as I mentioned to you before, because one, I'm doing a matter that has to be true. Two, I don't want to be held to account by Allah Ta'ala. So we our methods should be twice as stringent.
Jazakumullah khair. Dr. Ekub, there's a comment here. I don't know if you want to shed light on this because I did see it kind of discussing. I rather just ask you. I mean, this is a question that some people have asked. On the front cover, there's a question mark on
Oh
why
yeah.
history matters.
Yeah.
I did look at certain kind of like different. I had a look around at this online,
Mm.
and I saw
Mm.
certain other versions of this book had a like semicolon, why history matters, and then it would go straight to reviving faith through the lens of history. Uh, Doctor, Saab, any comment on this? I mean,
So this was quite interesting because a lot of people have asked me why the question mark, and it was something that was introduced by the publisher, and I had a conversation with them, and it's part of the series that the publishers have done, in which they wanted to ask the question in an inquisitive manner. So rather than me making an absolute statement, what they wanted to do was have people make the case that this was
yeah,
a question. And because to be honest with you, it's not necessary. The question mark's not needed when you
yes,
have a WH question word in the beginning. But the publishers who are doing a series of books, so they've got a new book coming out, Why Poetry Matters for Muslims, and
yeah,
why and so forth. They wanted to put that, so I
yeah.
left that to them.
If it helps at all, I mean, I'm not an expert in English, but I just asked ChatGPT as well, and they said you're
Yeah,
absolutely fine to even keep a question, to be honest.
to be honest
Uh,
with you, I asked ChatGPT myself. I
yeah,
even asked DeepSeek just to be sure.
and they
Uh,
said it's fine. They actually
yeah,
said,
they said it's fine. And look, I've been
yeah,
teaching history. I've been teaching English. I used to teach English in Damascus, and I've been teaching English for 20 years. And I still had to double check that.
yeah,
But it's a convention of the publishers, and to some
yeah,
degree,
sure.
just for your readers, that when you're writing books, sometimes you have a relationship with the publishing house as well, and they have some agency.
Yes, exactly. I just thought I'd ask that because I thought I don't want to avoid that question just in case
No,
on the
it's
other
fine.
groups,
It's
then
fine. It's
people
fine. It's
start
fine.
bringing that up as well, that they
Yeah, yeah.
purposefully avoided this question. I'd rather we just, and Jazakallah for that answer. As a young Muslim today who wants benefit from studying history beyond just knowledge, what practical steps should they take to translate historical lessons into action in their own life?
Yeah, I think this is a great question, and it's a hard one at the moment. So, my concern has been the dearth of historians that exist within our sort of like space at the moment. Because an extension of this question is people often ask me, what books can we read? And I will say to them that you have literacy, but you're not literate, and they get surprised by that. And I say, well, what you can read and write, but you're not literate in the subject area. So what often happens, and I think I said this in one of the chats I was in, like, just because somebody can read Arabic doesn't mean they have literacy in they're literate in Quran. They're literate in tafsir. It doesn't work like this, right? In fact, the unique thing about Rasul being Ammi and still being the expert on Quran, it sort of flips that on his head a little bit. That just because you have the capacity to be able to just read newspapers and the internet and so forth. And the reason why I'm explaining that, perhaps, and people might think it's strange, is because we assume that by going into Waterstones and Amazon and picking up a book in history and reading it, that somehow I've now become an expert where I can start applying all these questions and so forth. In actuality, um, history is a vocation that's taught. It's always been taught within the classroom. And I think my argument has been, which is that we need to find a way of curating spaces where we go back to teaching history to Muslims as a staple. But one of the things that I wanted to do as an extension of this book was called the Muslim History Workshop, which was to go around places and do a 2-day workshop of actually training people in how they change the way that they engage with history reading, so that when they're reading history books, that they have enough um, skepticism in being able to challenge or at least be careful of what they're engaging with and not taking it as fact, because they recognize that the lens in which they're seeing it is different than the lens in which it's written from, right? Um, and I think that that's important. In regards to what lessons we can take, I then am reluctant to tell the individual to pick up history books and just say, what lessons can we take from this? It requires experts to be able to give those expert analysis in terms of how the comparisons are possible and so forth. And I make one point in the book about, as Muslims, we have a different conception of time, right? This is why in most religions, time was cyclical. It wasn't linear. And it's a cycle in the sense that Life has a beginning and life has an end. And we have a day of judgment and then we will have an end. And so Allah Ta'ala, and this is why people like Ibn Khaldun and Malik bin Nabi, and I speak about these thinkers, they talk about cycles. Now, how do we make sense of those cycles? I think that's an important point. How do we examine those cycles? And the Quran is not a linear book. It doesn't have a beginning or an end, right? So it disrupts our understanding of time, even in the Quran. It has an opening. And so this is one of the things that once we change the way we see, so I give you an example. Allah Ta'ala is the accelerator. Now, this is important to understand that Allah Ta'ala accelerates time. If we understand time as just unit, one, two, three, then we don't understand it in that way. But if we understand, like if I had, like my father, his age is accelerating, he's aging fast, and his time is shifting quickly. I'm now starting to see something different. When we see like empires and nations and civilizations, that for long stretches everything's okay, and then there are moments of accelerations, then you start to realize something. And there are many moments in human history where we see these acceleration moments. And one of the things I'm noticing right now is even this current conflict that started from October the 7th, is it feels like an acceleration moment. And some pieces are moving very quickly. And this is the qadr of Allah Ta'ala, perhaps. And we're too deep in it really to possibly know. But so these skills or these ideas, these different thought patterns, I really hope that we could teach them um, to empower then Muslims to be able to engage with the books. And then the next thing is knowledge production itself. So many parents come to me and say, "What books can my children read? How can I homeschool them? Where are the Islamic history books for our kids?" And we haven't produced for this generation. We're not producing them, and we need to. We need to start that movement. And so this is what the book is Why History Matters is the intervention to say, look, there's so much we need to do here. There was, as I said, there was Raphael Samuel was a Marxist thinker who came up with this idea of the history workshop. And in the history workshop, people like Samuel Huntington, Eric Hobsbawm, they became inspired and they started to write books on the critique of modernity and secularism. And I think that there's time to do a Muslim history workshop where we use our own ideas.
Dr. Saab, we got another question here. As a junior academic in business
Mhm.
ethics research in the UK, I find that I am forced to explain Islamic philosophy in secular friendly terms while trying to remain true to Islamic ontology. I have tried to justify this by believing that the akhlaq of Islamic ethics may lead readers to explore the religion further, in the same way that Islam spread through the adab of Muslim traders, i.e., witness ihsan led to Islam for many. So far, I have found Catholic academics to be more encouraging of my being authentically Muslim in this space than Muslim colleagues. Does this mindset make me a secular agent? What would you suggest academics in my position do to create authentic Islamic knowledge within UK universities? Is this possible, or does it require building alternative institutions, starting authentically Islamic journals and forms of online knowledge production? Jazakallah khair.
I think it's a great question, and it's something that I've been grappling with myself. Now, what I did, and I'll be honest with the person who asked the question, I left academia. I said, okay, this is difficult. I mean, one of the things I found interesting was people like, so when I did a presentation of this book, I remember one sister came to me. She goes, "But when I read the book, don't you think you could have accommodated a non-Muslim reader some more?" And I said, "But I have accommodated a non-Muslim reader. I'm writing universally." And what was interesting is she felt that I should have toned down some of the Islamic discourse in the book to accommodate a wider readership. And I tried to explain to her, first and foremost, I'm at the moment I am speaking directly to Muslims as the community. This book is written for them, and it has a right to exist. But secondly, when you look at people like C.S. Lewis and Tolkien, who were professors at Oxford University, they were very unapologetic about the works that they were writing. In fact, one of the books I read by C.S. Lewis, who did the Chronicles of Narnia, he wrote a book called Angels. It's a very interesting little pamphlet. And he made the argument of how could I speak about angels in the academy, as a devout Christian, an academic. And he wanted to have that sort of like polemical discourse. I think from my experience, more and more Muslims in the academy are pushing the boundaries in the sense where Islam can be spoken of more authentically. Um, and more Muslims, especially in the field of Islamic studies and Islamic history, are starting to challenge the secular gatekeepers. And the power and the pendulum is swinging in the direction of Muslim researchers to some degree. Although Muslim researchers are finding it very difficult to get the same type of scholarships or opportunities or job opportunities. But where the challenge lies is still that the tradition itself is secular. And so for me, um, Nadwi once again makes the case that there was a need to counter Western forms of knowledge production in that language, and it should be access to the regular reader. But at the same time, there needs to be works written for Muslim audiences in their own language. And that might be an endeavor that you might want to exercise in, which is in the Western academic space. You become skilled enough to be able to engage in that space and speak in that vocabulary and grammar. And yet, then when you're speaking to the Ummah, that you are capable of making that code switch, as we call it, to be able to speak to them in that. Now, for me, I'm no longer interested in being an academic and engaging with a large corpus of non-Muslim thinkers speaking about me and my subject area. I feel that today, with the conditions we've had post Gaza, that I want to expedite the teaching to Muslims. And so for me, that new space is what I'm trying to curate, which is a space where I can try to put all my energy into Muslim students, rather than hoping that I'll have a Muslim student in one of my universities when I'm teaching.
And I think, Dr. Jacob, one of the new spaces that has definitely opened up, I think you'd agree, is Substack. I think that seems to be one of those. And I think one of the, again, I don't vouch for everything they write. I've not read everything, but one of the articles I read the other day from, I think, a writer who's got a magazine called Kasurian or something. I really enjoyed one of their articles. I think that could be something going forward as Muslims. We write in that academic fashion, and the writing was just absolutely phenomenal that that individual had come up with. There
Yeah,
was a
so
question.
Ahmed is a good thinker, and he was a student of mine in Turkey,
Wow.
and he's a sharp kid, and he's doing interesting things, and this is the idea of the new spaces that we are trying to imagine.
Absolutely fantastic. I didn't know that I mean that the one that he wrote on riding the tiger of modernity, that was just
Mhm.
that's genius,
Yeah.
subhanallah. There was a question about the kind of different books written on Ottoman history, but that, to be honest with you, in the course we do discuss that, and to be honest with you, already one audio in our course Telegram group. It's been so beneficial. It's just made me kind of buy so many different books on Ottoman history as well. Just that one audio from Dr. Yaqub. So inshallah, we'll leave that for Tuesday. Dr. Yaqub, I think we'll end with one question from myself, which was, I do know there's another book coming as well, and I was going to pre-order it, but I thought I'll kind of just wait and just wait until it comes out and then I'll get it. Which was on the Ottoman ulama. If you want to maybe just for 2 3 minutes just expand on what that is about.
Yeah, so that was my PhD thesis. I had finally converted it into a manuscript. So the narrative of the late Ottoman period in the 19th century is that constitutionalism was a Western enterprise, and it was Western intervention into the Ottoman world, and the Ottomans were simply trying to copy the West. And so basically what was happening is that the Ottomans were abandoning the Sharia and so on. And in actuality, my research showed, and that wasn't the intention, but that's what I discovered, which was there was a huge ideological bias towards the ulama in Ottoman studies in the 20th century. So thinkers like Bernard Lewis and Orientalists like this were heavily influential, and Bernard Lewis was also a Zionist, heavily influential on making the case that the ulama were backwards and decadent and had no real influence on political theory in the Ottoman Empire. And I discovered that that's not true. And so I show how the Ottomans, I mean, to one degree, do examine the Western sort of like attempts of constitutionalism, but what they do is they are working towards the establishment of a constitutional theory in conformity with the idea of the Khilafah. So it's different from the idea of the nation state, in which there are clearer guidelines of the prerogatives of the Sultan as Khalifa. And the ulama were positing themselves as the constituent group that were like a meta institution where they oversaw the legislative and the executive to some degree to make sure that the state did not go beyond the bounds of Islam. So that was what the book is. It's with Edinburgh University Press. Unfortunately, it's pricey because it's a university press book. These books are designed to go into university libraries. But I'll be doing more and more discussions and conversations on them because that's what the publisher would want when the book comes out on July the 31st.
Absolutely.
But that's the main crux of it. And then also revolution, which is that the so the ulama, the standard position in the Ottoman Empire was that it's better to remove a leader from authority than to allow authority to crush the masses of the ummah, which is very different than what happened in Syria, which is that the critique was being laid at the masses to calm down and absolve in power. Whereas in the Ottoman Empire, it is a consistent theme that it's better to remove the imam from authority and replace him with someone else than to use violence against the society. It was a very unique way of then trying to clarify these checks and balances. So, yeah, that's what the book is mainly.
Jazakumullah khairan so much, Dr. When we are looking forward to that book. That book comes out on July 31st. You might just
Mm.
want to add it to your list. I will, inshallah, also put that in the description. I'll put both books, although I think the first one is sold out. I've just seen in the chat everyone saying it's not available anywhere because it is sold out. I'll try to find somewhere if we can, inshallah, where it might be still in stock. I mean, I'll try to put it in the chat or in the description of the video. Also, I'll put this, the ulama book as well, Ottoman ulama, in the description of the video. And I'll also, guys, inshallah ta'ala, put the link for our course that begins on Ottoman history this Tuesday, inshallah ta'ala, this Tuesday evening, 8:30 p.m. to 9:30 p.m. UK time, just 1 hour every week. And inshallah ta'ala, it'll be a fantastic course. We're really looking forward to that course as well. I don't want to take too much of your time, Dr. Yaqub. I know we've got Maghrib Salah now also just around the corner. And I think we've also I think someone's got a question. Has Dr. Saab also written something on the Druze? I'm no idea who the Druze
So
who
I haven't written about the Druze. No,
no. Okay.
no.
No. So I think that answers that question. And I think we will stop there with the questions, inshallah. Jazakumullah khair Hassan. So much to everyone. Jazakumullah khair to Dr. Saab for taking out his precious time from a Saturday as well to spend a bit of time with us. And I hope you enjoyed the video. I hope whoever's accessing this video from seeing the recording, I hope you also benefit. And I also hope that you get the book and you also join the course. Jazakumullah khair Hassan, everyone. And we hope to see you on the course. Jazakumullah khair Hassan.
Barakallahu feek.